We are about to begin the second panel session, so please be seated. I hope that you had a sound sleep last night after a hectic first day of KFGS. And now, welcome to the second panel session on visions for a multicultural world. And it is my pleasure to present our panel moderator, Dr. Kyung-Koo, Professor of Liberal Studies College at Seoul National University. As a noted cultural anthropologist, Dr. Han is also currently serving as the president of the Korean Immigration Association, the vice president of the Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology, and he's also a member of the Korean National Commission of UNESCO. So from now on, Dr. Han will moderate the panel. Please welcome Dr. Han Kyung-Koo.
Hi, good morning. One of the role of the moderator is to introduce the participants, and I think, but today we do not really need introduction. We have Professor Kymlicka from Queen's University, and we have Assistant Secretary Warren Pearson from Australian government. I think you heard them yesterday, so I will ask first Professor Kymlicka to start, and you know how it proceeds. There will be presentations, and the panel will ask questions among us, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll take questions. So I will ask Professor Kymlicka.
Thank you, Dr. Han, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. So I want to tell you a slightly different story about the fate of multiculturalism than Christian gave us yesterday. So it's not a diametrically opposite story. I think some of the differences are more subtle than might be thought. But I'll nonetheless try to highlight some of the differences. So as many of you will know, there's a kind of a powerful narrative about the rise and fall of multiculturalism across the Western democracies. And there have been several high-profile declarations of the failure and the death of multiculturalism. And the assumption, people don't agree about what should replace multiculturalism, but the assumption is that we are already in a post-multicultural age. So I have a different view of the state of play on multiculturalism, and I think that multiculturalism has more life in it than the usual narrative tells us, and that it remains a viable option for the future. So one way to start in thinking about the different story I want to tell is to ask what multiculturalism is. And on the usual account, typically offered by critics of multiculturalism, multiculturalism should be understood as a set of policies or an ideology that's committed to this kind of reproduction of differences in perpetuity. So the idea is that people immigrants arrive in a country with a particular set of cultural practices, and the goal of multiculturalism is to ensure that those cultural practices get reproduced, untouched, unchanged in perpetuity. And if you think that that's the goal of multiculturalism, you might also think that the best way to ensure that those cultural practices get reproduced, untouched, uncontaminated by the larger society is to segregate groups. That'll make it more likely and easier for each group to reproduce its own culture. And so you get the image that multiculturalism is about parallel societies. This is a familiar criticism in Europe, that multiculturalism is about separating and segregating groups into parallel societies. And for critics, this has a number of perverse effects. On the one hand, this emphasis on the reproduction of static cultural differences is seen as neglecting what are the real needs of immigrants. Immigrants come to a country for a better life for themselves and their children, and for many of them, their priorities, therefore, are jobs, housing, education for their children, and all of these seem to be just neglected by multiculturalism, which is only obsessed with the reproduction of cultural difference. And even with respect to cultural difference, the idea that we should be inherently committed to reproducing cultural differences seems implausible, given that some of those cultural differences may be inconsistent with basic human rights. So if some groups bring with them practices of, say, coerced marriages or honor killings, why would we want to support those or reproduce those? And more generally, this idea of multiculturalism as the reproduction of cultural differences seems to be, both in its inspiration and effect, to be about polarizing relations between groups, about exaggerating the differences between them, putting up barriers between them, rather than any conception of integration or social cohesion. Okay, so that's the usual story about what multiculturalism is and why it's been a failure and why we need to move beyond it. I have a completely different picture about what multiculturalism is, what it has been, what its goals have been. And one way to think about this is to situate multiculturalism in a historical context. And so I believe that multiculturalism is best understood as part and parcel of a larger human rights revolution. That in Western democracies, up until the Second World War and beyond, Western democracies were based on a set of assumptions about racial hierarchy. That, so my country, Canada, was founded on the premise that white Europeans had the right to go colonize the Americas. That's a very explicit racialist ideology of European colonialism. But similar racial ideologies justified our restrictive immigration policy, which up until the 1960s made it impossible for people other than Europeans to emigrate to Canada. So we had a racially restrictive immigration policy, as did the United States, as did Australia. And so these assumptions about racial hierarchy permeated the very structure of Western states. But those ideologies were discredited by the Second World War, by Nazism. And since the Second World War, we've committed ourselves as an international community to the equality of races and peoples. And that has put in place a whole series of social and political movements to contest the ways in which societies have been historically structured on hierarchical grounds. And there are many examples of these movements that have been inspired by the human rights revolution. Decolonization is one of them. So, as I said, colonialism was grounded on assumptions of racial hierarchy, and so after World War II, we had the national liberation struggles by colonial states, which was the era of decolonization was roughly 1948 to 1965. And then that partly helped to inspire the African-American civil rights struggle in the 50s and 60s to contest the legacies of racial ideology in the United States. And then starting in the mid to late 1960s, we saw what I would call struggles for multiculturalism, which around the world, which are, like the African-American struggle, they are in part struggles for anti-discrimination, but they're also struggles for the recognition and valorization of differences that have historically been stigmatized. And we see a number of examples of these struggles for multiculturalism or minority rights or indigenous rights. In the Canadian context, the dramatic uprise in mobilization of indigenous peoples for land rights and self-government rights. We've had the mobilization of historic regional minorities like the Scots, the Catalans, the Quebecois for autonomy and language rights. And we've seen struggles by immigrant origin groups for various forms of recognition and protection. So this, to my mind, is the origins of multiculturalism. It's one of the manifestations of a broader human rights revolution that's struggling against historic hierarchies, and those should be seen in an even wider set of social movements that emerged at the same time in the 1960s. Second wave feminism, the struggle for women's rights, gay rights, the rights of people with disabilities, all of these emerged at roughly the same time. And they all took the form of contesting historic hierarchies by which some people claimed the right to rule essentially through coercion and paternalism over others. And all of these are essentially, they're often called citizenship movements because they're attempting to define new relations of democratic citizenship that contest older ideologies of hierarchy and try to replace these older relations of coercion and paternalism with relations that are based on consent and autonomy and trust and participation and hence more truly democratic. So that's my account of the rise of multiculturalism. The specific form that multiculturalism will take in terms of policies is going to vary from country to country and indeed from group to group. So obviously the rights of indigenous peoples are very different from the rights of immigrant groups. In relation to immigrant groups, a colleague and I, Keith Banting, have developed an index of what we take to be the paradigmatic examples of multiculturalism policies for immigrant groups. And if you have your booklet with you that has all the presentations, on pages 75 and 76, there's a list of the 8 paradigmatic multiculturalism policies that Keith and I think exemplify multiculturalism in relation to immigrant groups across the Western democracies. Okay, so that's my account of what multiculturalism is, both in its general historical context and aspirations and in terms of the concrete policies, which are things like multicultural education and ethnic sensitivity in the media and various forms of consultation and representation. Okay, so that's if you like, what I take to be the progressive and worthwhile aspirations of multiculturalism. That raises the question whether we have any evidence whether it's working in practice. Have these multiculturalism policies in fact helped to create more inclusive, more democratic relations across ethnic and racial lines? And that's an interesting question which is actually surprisingly understudied in the social science literature. We have not nearly as much evidence as I would have liked. We've had multiculturalism policies for 40 years in some Western democracies, and you would have thought we'd now have much better evidence, but it remains quite scarce on the ground. But nonetheless, I think we have some preliminary evidence, some provisional evidence about the effects of multiculturalism. I'm from Canada, and this is an issue that we have in fact studied quite intensively in the Canadian context, and the vast majority of social scientists who work on this issue in Canada have concluded that multiculturalism policies are having beneficial effects for the integration of immigrants, that both at a symbolic level by creating a new conception of national identity, differences are acknowledged and seen as a legitimate part of the country, and in a much more practical and tangible way by assisting the self-organization and representation of ethnic groups, giving them a seat at the table and helping them to have greater voice and greater skills in relation to the political system. The Canadian story may be an exception, and this is something that a number of critics have argued, that we shouldn't generalize from the Canadian story. So we should try to look at whether there's better cross-national evidence about the effects of multiculturalism policies. As I said, there's not as much as I would like, but there are a few studies that attempt to compare countries, asking whether those countries that have adopted more of the multiculturalism policies that I've listed on 74 and 75, whether they're doing better or worse than countries that have not gone down the multicultural road with respect to political participation of immigrants, with respect to the performance of immigrants in the labor market, with respect to levels of trust and prejudice across ethnic lines. And those few studies that have been done, I think, show that multiculturalism policies are having a positive effect. Countries that have gone farther down the multicultural road are doing better on those criteria than those countries that have fewer or none of the multiculturalism policies. Okay, so if that's right, if multiculturalism policies have these progressive aspirations, and if there's no evidence that they're failing, and indeed some provisional evidence that they're succeeding, why has there been such a backlash? Why has there been such a retreat against multiculturalism? So part of my answer to that question is that there hasn't been a retreat from multiculturalism policies. So one of the things Keith and I have done with the index is to actually try to figure out which countries have adopted and or repudiated multiculturalism policies on this list. And so if you turn to page 97 of the booklet, we have a chart that measures how different Western democracies score in terms of the number of multiculturalism policies from that list that they've adopted at 3 different points in time, 1980, 2000, and 2010. And if you just look at the bottom row, you can see there's a consistent increase in the average score of multiculturalism from 1980 to 2000 to 2010. So in general, across the Western democracies, they continue to be adopting multiculturalism policies. There are some striking exceptions. The most high-profile one is the Netherlands, which, if you look at it, has a dramatic drop in its multiculturalism policy score between 2000 and 2010. And the Netherlands is widely cited as the kind of paradigm case of a retreat from multiculturalism. But if you look at other countries, including other countries in Western Europe, the Netherlands stands out as an exception. And other countries have either maintained their multiculturalism scores, like Britain, the United Kingdom, or indeed have quite substantially increased their multiculturalism policies between 2000 and 2010. So look at Finland, which has gone from 1.5 to 6. And that's just one of several European countries that have increased their multiculturalism scores. Okay, so I think what we see, if we look at actual public policies, there has not been a significant retreat of multiculturalism across the Western democracies. What we do see, what unquestionably has happened, is there's been a retreat from the word multiculturalism. Political parties, government spokespeople in many European countries are absolutely refuse to use the word multiculturalism as the label for these policies. The word multiculturalism has become a taboo word. So they describe these policies exist, they continue to exist, but they're now discussed under a different label. They may be discussed as diversity policies, or as community cohesion policies, or as interculturalism policies. But at the policy level, there has not been any dramatic retreat from them. But one other change that has taken place, and this is what Christian mentioned, is the rise of what he calls what many people call civic integration policies, which are these policies that expect immigrants to go through classes and tests in order to show how well they're integrating at different stages of the process. In some cases, even before they are admitted to the country, they need to show some test of knowledge of the language of the country, or once they arrive, they need to take courses and tests in order to renew their residency, or in order to gain access to welfare state benefits, or in order to become a citizen. And so a number of European countries have ratcheted up the number of these civic integration requirements for immigrants. And when people talk about the retreat from multiculturalism, I think that's really what they're talking about, is the growth of these civic integration policies, which they are simply equating with the retreat from multiculturalism. Or they're assuming that if you adopt civic integration policies, you must therefore be retreating from multiculturalism. These are seen as zero-sum. If you're moving in the civic integration direction, you must be retreating from multiculturalism. But as the scores show, that's not the way these things are actually played out in most European countries. Civic integration policies are being layered on top of multiculturalism policies, which remain in place, and in some cases are actually strengthening. So this is the way I perceive the situation across the Western democracies, is that civic integration policies are being layered on top of multiculturalism policies, which persist and in some cases are strengthened. So that raises a question: how exactly is civic integration and multiculturalism related to each other? How do they coexist? So, as I say, many people seem to think this is a kind of philosophical contradiction, that you could at the same time be pursuing civic integration policies and multiculturalism policies. I don't think there's an inherent philosophical contradiction between the two. Certainly in the Canadian case, we have always had civic integration policies. So for example, in order to become a Canadian citizen, you must learn either English or French. We have had a language test for citizenship for 100 years. It's not a new thing, and no one has ever thought that that was somehow inconsistent with multiculturalism. The idea that you would have naturalization requirements is not inherently inconsistent with multiculturalism. So at least as a Canadian, we just take it as normal and natural that there would be some combination of civic integration and multiculturalism, but there are some combinations that really are problematic. There are some forms of civic integration policies that I think are both philosophically inconsistent with multiculturalism and erode the spirit or the ethos of multiculturalism. And I would highlight two areas in which there can be a contradiction between the two. One is how the burden of responsibility for meeting civic integration is allocated between the larger society and immigrant groups. So in the Canadian case, the Canadian government funds, offers to immigrants citizenship classes, language classes, so that they can then, they are enabled to meet whatever requirements are attached to the naturalization tests. And the naturalization tests themselves are not particularly onerous or heavy. They're intended to be ones that immigrants can meet with any kind of reasonable good faith effort. So they're not intended to exclude people. Whereas some of the civic integration programs in Europe are much, they put all of the burden on immigrants. Immigrants are forced to attend the classes, they're forced to pay for the classes, and the standards they are expected to meet are very high. And so they're just much more burdensome and coercive. A second area in which I think civic integration policies can be deeply problematic is on the nature of the national identity that is represented to immigrants and that immigrants are expected to come to identify with over time. So in the Canadian context, the Canadian national identity has been quite explicitly portrayed in public documents, in the citizenship classes and citizenship tests, as an identity that is additive. That is, when immigrants are expected, and we hope immigrants will become loyal and patriotic Canadians, but we don't think that requires them to disavow their earlier identities. So the Canadian identity is added on top of other identities that they have, and we don't view this as zero-sum. We don't think that in order to be a better Canadian, you must diminish, weaken your other identities. It's not a hydraulic system where if you push one up, that means you must be pushing the other one down. On the contrary, we operate on the premise that you can be a proud Canadian and proud of your Greek ancestry or your Vietnamese ancestry, and that there's no logical or empirical contradiction between having strong ethnic identities and having strong Canadian national identities. Whereas in some European countries, these are seen as zero-sum, and that if immigrants are seen as having too strong a commitment to their religion or their country of origin, that's assumed to be evidence that they have not adequately come to identify with their new country of origin. So I mean, there are other issues we could talk about if we're thinking about the normative, the ethics of civic integration policies. But I think what we're seeing emerging is that a set of countries, both in the New World and in some countries in Western Europe, are adopting a combination of multiculturalism policies with inclusive and non-coercive and enabling civic integration policies. And that combination, I think, is perfectly consistent and indeed is the most normatively attractive. So inclusive and non-burdensome civic integration policies can be quite consistently and effectively layered on top of multiculturalism policies, whereas we have other countries in Western Europe which are defining their civic integration policies in ways that are much more harshly punitive, burdensome, paternalistic, coercive, and which define national identity in zero-sum terms, and which therefore are radically inconsistent with any ethos of multiculturalism. And so I just want to emphasize that, just in conclusion, that the development of these civic integration policies it's an important shift in the way in which immigrant integration is discussed and the policy frameworks around them. But we shouldn't take them inherently as evidence that multiculturalism has been retreat, and that there are at least some versions of a combination of civic integration and multiculturalism that are empirically feasible and normatively attractive. Thanks.
Yes, in a nutshell, multiculturalism is very much alive, and as a rose is a rose by any other name. It's multiculturalism is a multiculturalism, whatever you may call. Okay, we'll have Mr. Pearson.
Well, as you gathered yesterday from when I talked at lunch, multiculturalism is the heart of the Australian nation. My talk is about whether Australian multiculturalism is the result of genius or just good fortune. You'll have to excuse me if I touch on the themes of the other two panels of realities and actions, because in Australia our visions, I think, are complemented by actions, and it is our reality. Australia, as I said, is a traditional migrant country, and really my talk is a case study to tell you the story of Australia's multicultural journey. According to the latest national census held in August 2011, over a quarter, 26% of Australia's population, it was about 21.5 million at the time, were born outside of Australia. So 26% are born outside of Australia. A further 20% of the Australian-born population had at least one parent born outside of Australia. So this means that nearly half of our population have very immediate family ties abroad. We identify with around ancestries or ethnicities and speak about 300 languages, including Indigenous languages. And we're proud of the fact that we're one of the most culturally diverse nations on earth. Sometimes this is taken for granted. In reality, it's evolved over a long period of time. And my presentation will bring together Australia's past and its significant contribution both today and to the vision of multiculturalism in Australia. From the start of European settlement in 1788 until 1947, so until relatively recently, the majority of our migrants came from the British Isles. Significant minorities in this period were also, though, German and Chinese. The German Lutherans could be described as our first refugees. They fled religious persecution from Prussia and first arrived in South Australia in 1838. They were followed by others who came for economic opportunities, particularly in agriculture. And still today, there's a rich legacy and heritage in the town of Harndorf in the Adelaide Hills, in the wine-growing region of the Barossa Valley. Migrants brought the wine industry to Australia. It's something that I'm personally very grateful for, particularly Adelaide Hill Sauvignon Blanc and Barossa Valley Shiraz. But I'll talk to you about that over dinner. For a few decades following Australia's gold rush in the 1850s, people from around the world travelled to the goldfields in Australia prospecting for gold. A very significant group were the industrious Chinese, who often worked the sites abandoned by the Anglo-Celtic miners. They were also very good merchants, and so they were actually supplying the miners. Through their hard work, the Chinese miners often found residual gold that had been missed, and their successes, and as a result, there was some resentment of their great success. This animosity and other events at the time led to the introduction of the immigration restrictions that I mentioned yesterday, known as the White Australia Policy. It was established by the newly federated Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. Before 1901, there were 6 separate British colonies. In 1901, the Federation came into being, and unfortunately, one of the very first acts of Parliament was the White Australia Policy. Today, many of the goldfields, though, are now heritage sites. The old gold mining town of Bendigo in Victoria, 2 hours just north of Melbourne, has a museum called the Golden Dragon Museum, and it celebrates the town's rich and long Chinese heritage. So by 1947, Australia has still had a very, very long way to becoming a diverse nation. This changed after the Second World War. Australia actively sought migrants, including displaced persons other than from the British Isles. For the first time, we were looking to Northern Europe and later to Southern Europe. This was the vision, and it was a vision espoused by our very first Minister for Immigration, Arthur Caldwell. He had the slogan, "Populate or perish." Australia had a very small population on a very large continent, and populate or perish was his vision. At the height of Australia's post-war migration boom, our largest source countries, aside from the United Kingdom, were Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, Italy, Greece. Like those from the United Kingdom, many people were encouraged to migrate Australia through assisted passage schemes. These schemes provided a free grant towards the cost of passage to Australia in return for a stay of at least 2 years from arrival. Migrants who returned prior to the end of the 2 years were required to pay back the government's what they paid for the passage. Overlaying on the migration restrictions still in place, the White Australia Policy, was the concept of assimilation. There was an expectation that the post-war European migrants who looked like Australians would become Australian. In so doing, they were expected to abandon their behaviours and languages of their homelands. The formation of ethno-specific organisations was viewed with great suspicion, particularly those that were political in nature. So post-war Australia, we were marginally more diverse. We certainly weren't multiculturalism. We still had an assimilation policy. Towards the end of the 1960s, the assimilationist approach was becoming difficult to support. Many Northern Europeans, Germans, Poles and Dutch, came by themselves or in couples, and they quickly adapted and blended into Australian society, determined to be indistinguishable from other Australians. And I certainly, my experience at school was there were boys in my school who were clearly migrants who were desperately trying to be more Australian than I was. Conversely, many Southern Europeans from Italy and Greece arrived with familiar compatriots, not only their relatives, but others from the same villages. Migration from these countries became characterised by chain migration, in which extended family and others from the same town and villages followed. In Australia, the Greek Orthodox Church played an enormous part in the lives of Greek Australians, looking after their well-being, welfare and cultural needs. Despite the prevailing dominant assimilationist approach at the time, the Greek Orthodox Church wasn't going to readily allow the cultural identity of its community, its congregation, to be suppressed. Similarly, the culture brought to Australia by Italian migrants was endured and was very strong despite the assimilationist policy. Today, the largest non-British ancestry in Australia is Italian, nearly 1 million people claiming Italian in last year's census. Italian culture is an integral part of Australian society. Italian food is everywhere. It's no longer exotic. So between 1966 and 1972, restrictions on migration were gradually easing. In 1967, the assisted passage scheme was extended to Turkey and to what would be the largest non-European source of migrants to Australia at that time. While the Turkish guest worker schemes in Europe of the day were intended to be temporary, Australia offered permanent migration to whole families. This was also a time when the notion of assimilation gave way to what was called integration. It was not strictly defined, but it acknowledged the acceptance and tolerance of new elements in society while recognising the emergence of ethno-specific organisations. So there was an acceptance that people wanted to get together with like people, but the government didn't necessarily understood the value of those organisations. The 1970s was a watershed moment in Australian history. In August 1973, a vision for multiculturalism was first stated by the Minister for Immigration. His name was Al Grasby. He said, "My concept of a society able to sustain growth and change without disintegration is a society based on equal opportunity for all." Equal opportunity for all. A goal which no right-thinking person could dispute, but the striving for which has led to traditionally some of the deepest conflicts in society. This means full scope for all to develop their personal potential, no matter how diverse their origins, belief, wealth, or ability. The essence of his argument was equal opportunity. Not that we're all the same, but we all have the same opportunity. Australia was being described as a multicultural nation. Our first official national multicultural policies, designed with a primary focus on assisting new migrants to settle, were introduced in 1978, and these settlement programs continue today. In 1975, the Australian Parliament passed the Racial Discrimination Act, which made discrimination unlawful in employment, in the provision of services based on colour, race, descent, or national or ethnic origin. In 1976, Australia began accepting Indo-Chinese refugees, which changed the character of migration, particularly those fled from Vietnam and from refugee camps where they were through Southeast Asia. It was the largest intake of people from Asia since the days of the gold rush. It really tested Australia's commitment to our relatively new still at that time, non-discriminatory migration policy and multiculturalism. So by the end of the 1970s, the genius of Australian multiculturalism was just beginning to match the good fortune of our migration history. So getting closer to home from the 1980s, closer to now, Australia's concept of multiculturalism was further refined in 1999 when the National Agenda for a Multicultural Australia was introduced as a policy for managing the consequences of cultural diversity in the interests of the individual and in the interests of the welcoming society. However, Australia and multiculturalism is much more than this. Central to Australia's approach to multiculturalism is the balance between rights and responsibilities. The key social liberty of maintaining and expressing cultural traditions and language is weighed up against loyalty to Australia and its people, upholding Australian laws and democracy, and respecting everyone's rights and liberties. I think that the citizenship-based nature of Australian multiculturalism has been a big part of the success, and I think it is good fortune that essentially Australia was an island continent a very long way away from the source countries. So people weren't going to go home. You know, it's a long way from Australia to Turkey. It's a bit closer from Turkey to Germany. Therefore, the assumption was you were going to come and stay, and the assumption was that we had to make it work. So I think that's the good fortune bit. The genius bit is that we understood that and made it work. So the rights and responsibilities are enshrined in Australia's citizenship affirmation. As an Australian citizen, I affirm my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. In Australia, we encourage all our permanent migrants who meet the eligibility requirements, including of being of good character, to apply for citizenship. In Australia, whether you're an Australian citizen by birth or an Australian citizen by acquisition, your rights are exactly the same. There are no laws to deprive a naturalised citizen of their citizenship unless they were fraudulent in their application for citizenship. Citizenship is a fundamental part of what unites Australia. Not race, not ethnicity, not ancestry, but your identity and the civic institutions of the nation. In launching the current National Multicultural Policy in February 2011, and there are a couple of copies of this just outside, it's a fairly simple document because we don't overthink multiculturalism in Australia, and there are a few additional initiatives that underpin our ongoing programs. But in launching that new fresh policy in 2011, the Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Chris Bowen, described respect for Australian values, commitment to Australia through citizenship, and political bipartisanship as the elements that underpinned the genius of Australian multiculturalism. The policy makes it clear that within Australia, Australian law, people are free to practice their cultural traditions, free from discrimination. It's also worth mentioning that in parts of the world where some have claimed that multiculturalism has failed, it's not the same brand as multiculturalism that has been a remarkable success in Australia. It's a very slippery term, multiculturalism, and I think probably everybody in the room has a different definition of that. Associated with multicultural policies are settlement programs to assist new migrants to belong and participate fully in society. And there are a few brochures, again outside, called The Settlement Journey. It summarises the programs that the Australian government has to settle new migrants, largely with a focus on refugee migrants rather than people who don't need that extra support. But it's an interesting read. The cornerstone of the settlement programs is the Adult Migrant English Program, AMEP. It dates back to 1948 and assists new migrants in gaining English language proficiency. Orientation and intensive assistance are also provided to recently arrived migrants who need it to connect them with mainstream services. These are provided by government-funded migrant resource centres and other specialised providers, particularly for refugee and humanitarian entrants. We also acknowledge that not all of these people will ever be proficient or functional in English. This is where help is provided through the Translating and Interpreting Service, a national government initiative. Many government agencies provide services in translated materials on websites and so on. Agencies include health, welfare and taxation. Consultation with community groups about the delivery of government services as part of what we call access and equity. It's a principle whereby the Australian government aims to provide services that are fair, easy to access and simple to use. Importantly, government services should respond to cultural and linguistic needs of Australia's diverse population. Closely tied to the continued success of multiculturalism is the need to maintain social cohesion. Without social cohesion and community harmony, questions arise about the benefits of multiculturalism, and I think that's perhaps what is going on in Europe. And so the questions about multiculturalism and questions about non-discriminatory migration program. However, returning to the days of assimilation and restricting migration on ethnic, racial or religious grounds would be a step backwards for Australia as a nation. In Australia, considerable effort goes towards ensuring the maintenance of social cohesion. Research undertaken by the Scanlon Foundation and led by Professor Andrew Marcus from Monash University has since 2007 provided us with a means of monitoring social cohesion through a number of indicators measuring belonging, worth, social justice, participation and acceptance. And this work allows us to prioritise, even to pinpoint precisely by location, where we need to devote effort in encouraging grassroots community organisations to build trust and engagement with community. In other words, social cohesion needs to be nurtured, not assumed. I started my presentation with a historical narrative to show how Australia has managed to build a multicultural society. I think it's important to acknowledge that this has evolved over a long period of time and with considerable effort. Christian is the elephant in the room, if you like. I think that Australia perhaps manages the civic integration and also the anti-discrimination in a balanced way. My argument is that they're not two one-way streets. They're two sides of the one coin, or perhaps they're a yin and yang. The balance of those two things is important. Today, the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimates our population to be 22.8 million people. Last financial year, which is July to June, Australia added nearly 185,000 permanent migrants, mostly through skilled migration, and mainly from India, China, the United Kingdom. In the same period, we accepted 13,700 refugees, and that number will be increased to 20,000 refugees in this current financial year. As at 30 June last year, there were nearly 1 million temporary visa holders in Australia of a population of 22 and a bit million. Just over 200,000 of that million were visitors, mainly tourists. Over 300,000 were students, nearly 140,000 were working holiday makers, and over 160,000 were on what we call visa subclass 457, which is a business long stay visa. And these people help to fill temporary skill shortages. Our permanent and temporary migration and humanitarian programs are successful because we invest heavily in our multicultural society. Temporary migration is growing, and we're at the moment looking at how temporary migration is growing, and we are at the moment looking at how so many people who are in Australia for a very short period of time might affect community dynamics and social cohesion. It's an area of considerable discussion at the moment, temporary migration. In the last 30 years, there have been challenges that have tested how we manage cultural diversity and maintain social cohesion. Whether resistance by some local communities to the arrival of new migrants, Vietnamese in the 1970s, or refugees from the Sudan in the 1990s, or tensions which sometimes do escalate into violence, Australian multiculturalism has withstood this challenge. Australia is a multicultural nation. It's not an aspiration. It's a description of who we are and who we are destined to be. Australian multiculturalism is probably both genius and good fortune. Its continued success is due to the contributions of successive Australian governments and, in the end, to the commitment of the people of Australia. Thank you.
Listening to this presentation, I felt that your presentation should have been in the realities or in the actions. Multiculturalism is not an aspiration, it's not a vision. Okay, now I ask myself to make a presentation. Finally, I feel a little comfortable. I used to have a sort of a wall or castle between me and the audience, and it's a very comfortable chair, but there's nothing in front of me, and I felt like naked. And I was especially uncomfortable because I prepared PowerPoint files for your pleasure, But I brought this, but somehow my file migrated, and I cannot locate them. So I will just depend on my verbal skills. But today we have the goal is coexistence. But what does it mean to coexist? It's, well, in one sense, on one extreme, we can think about really living together, cooperating, interacting, and influencing, and being influenced by each other, sharing life. But on the other hand, we can think about living together as living side by side without attempting to destroy each other, like in peaceful coexistence. So when, as an anthropologist, multiculturalism is a very uncomfortable idea. On the one hand, it talks about culture, and culture is the key word of anthropologists. So when people say culture is important, anthropologists should be happy. But at the same time, multiculturalism has a tendency to regard a person, an individual, as a member of a cultural group. And this is really uncomfortable in a sense, because the modern anthropologists, many modern anthropologists feel that a person can belong to, or a person can have many cultures. So multiculturalism is not just the cultures, multiple cultures. It happens inside me. Okay, so I chose to talk about marriage in the vision panel because as an anthropologist, one of the basic courses we have to take as a graduate school is kinship and marriage, and we have looked at many different forms of marriages. But when you talk about migration, everybody knows that there are many different ideas about marriage and many different forms. But still, it's a marriage partner, a spouse is considered to have to receive the same legal treatment. And also marriage is an extremely important means of migration. Actually, the many advanced countries which has a restriction on whom to allow to their countries, marriage and family reunion becomes the single most important avenue for migration. And another reason why I chose marriage for today is the peculiar Korean situation, because the Korean multicultural policy drive is centered on this international marriages, not foreign workers. So, and these foreign brides, foreign spouses, considered nationals because they've married. So there's a wide claim and complaints about the separate treatment of the foreign workers and foreign spouses. So Having said the reasons why I chose to talk about marriage, I will argue that marriage is a very public matter. It's usually considered as private. Right? You decide whom to marry. But as a consequence of your decision, it can give the entry ticket to certain countries. So it has a public consequence. And this makes marriage very much public. And many nations have developed devices to check, to find out whether the marriage is genuine. So you can see newspaper articles about discovering sham marriages and the new devices developed to discover sham marriages. In the PowerPoint file I tried to bring today, I had a very interesting picture which says the clergyman asking the married couple whether do you take this total stranger as your spouse? The headline of the caption in the picture was about the recent, I think it was several years ago, the effort of the United Kingdom to train clergymen so that they can find out whether the couple he or she is marrying genuine couples or not. So the migration, the border control police and the clergymen would work together to find out whether the marriage is genuine or not. So even while these measures are taking place, the basic assumptions about marriage do not seem to have changed. While the realities of marriage are so diverse and have changed very much. The laws and regulations on nationality and migration seem to be based on certain official assumptions about modern marriage in the West. However, even in the West, these assumptions are not shared by everybody. And moreover, nations and cultures have very different ideas and expectations about marriage. Well, one of the key assumptions about marriage in the West is that marriage is a private matter. And I've already said that it's private to the individuals, but it's not private to many others because of the particular arrangement about the spouse of a person in the advanced country, so that the spouse is given entry ticket. So if this marriage is public, then the question arises whether the political community have anything to say about that marriage. So my title was whether you can say anything about your neighbor's wife. And another assumption is that the marriage is based on love. Well, many family historians argue that even in the West, the idea of a romantic love is quite a recent phenomenon. Whether you believe it or not, it's certain that in many countries, in many cultures, love is not the basis for marriage. Affection, love, understanding, these are not creators of a marriage. They are rather creations of a marriage. You develop affection and understanding while living together. And you can, you have a lot of evidences about this arranged marriages. And the third assumption about marriage is that it should be free from any considerations about money. It should be romantic, but I think you know the word concept bride price or bride wealth, and I have a very peculiar feeling when I see this. The ability of the citizen of a so-called advanced country to sponsor the entry of his or her spouse as a peculiar form of bride price. You have it's not money, it's not property, and it's not even yours, but somehow you can give this right in exchange for the decision to marry him or her. And another assumption about marriage is that marriage is a union of individuals, while in many, as you know, in many other countries, it's not. And still another assumption is that marriage will last. It's a stable institution, but well, we all know that it's not that stable, and divorce rate is increasing very rapidly. So even though the assumption is that marriage is not a means but an end, in the migration situation of international migration, we can find many instances where marriage is a means. And also in international migration, there are certain expectations about gender roles, which is based on discrimination against women. So I think we really have to face certain questions. When marriage is a form of migration, right? We do not want it to be, but that's the realities. So whether it is proper and necessary for the political community to have something to say about the decision of your neighbor to marry, whether the state can intervene. This is a very difficult question because within the nation, within the state, right, it is outrageous and ridiculous for the state to intervene in marriage decisions. A poor person, an ignorant, an uneducated person, anybody can marry, and the state should not intervene unless the spouse is, underage, is not an adult. But what if, as a consequence of that decision, the state is providing this kind of entry ticket, which the person in question can use in the international marriage as a de facto bride price. So it might be that the state or many Korean local governments which were enthusiastic about this campaign to help marry the single young men, but not actually very young. They couldn't find brides who are willing to marry. So there's a single middle-aged men in the rural area. Well, they raised funds and they paid for the travel to go to Southeast Asia and find brides. And because many people believed that this is a very good countermeasure for the decreasing population of Korea, I think the local governments and the state and many individuals and groups or accomplices, or at least the bystanders of this possible human rights abuse and very shameful practices and discrimination against women. So then, what should we do? Well, I decided to talk about this question because I do not know the answer, and I'm in the process of providing. I and my colleagues providing a sort of a policy recommendation, a proposal on how to organize migration policy in Korea, and the foreign. This question of a foreign bride or foreign spouse is a very important question because the current policies are focused on this issue and it neglects the problems of a foreign worker. And if you control the entry of foreign workers, then it's quite natural that the many young men and women in the third world countries will try to enter through marriage. And this is, I think, is in a sense, it's a big tragedy because, well, officially, theoretically, it's based on free choice, but it's a free choice under very limited, the very difficult circumstances and with very limited options. So what should we do? And I think one of the nice thing about being a scholar is to decide to promise to talk about something in the future, and then force yourself to think about it. And then when I say this, I think I will have very interesting comments and suggestions. I know that this is a very sensitive issue, and in a sense, this is sometimes you feel politically very not correct when you talk about this question. But well, I said this, and I feel much more relieved now. Thank you very much for listening. Okay, we have some 10 minutes left, so we can ask questions among one another. And should we or should we not? Do you have any questions you want to address to?
I just had a very quick one in relation to where is the policy challenge in the marriage arrangement in Korea? Is the challenge that young Korean women don't want to move to the country and marry farmers, or is it actually a visa policy challenge? You're trying to create migration is the problem, or actually is the problem upstream?
Yeah, I think it's both, actually. Right, Korean young women, yeah, obviously there's a tendency not to marry people in the rural areas, but at the same time, but generally, I think fewer women want to marry. And also we have a big disproportion in population, the men and women ratio, because Koreans prioritize the sons, and for a certain period of time, they used this modern medical technology to have sons rather than daughters. I think it's a sort of a payback now. And because of there are so many single males in the rural area, and for a time, the government, actually local government, were involved, because in the old Korean tradition, when there was not drought, when the rain does not fall, and when there's a crisis, danger in agriculture, then people would say this is because of the sorrows of the unmarried men and women. So the head of the local government would try their best to find out the unmarried men and women and try to marry them together, so that the yin and yang can circulate and the rain will fall. So it has some political tradition too.
So I also had a question about so yesterday at the opening statements by some of the Korean government officials, they were throwing out the number of 1.4, 1.5 million foreign residents in Korea, and that's why it's important that we think about multiculturalism in the Korean context. But you're saying, if I understood correctly, that in fact foreign workers are not driving the policy agenda around multiculturalism, it's the foreign brides. So I'm wondering, I mean, this goes beyond the scope of your paper, but is that because the expectation is still that essentially all of the foreign workers are just temporary, and that they're going to go home sooner or later, and so that multiculturalism, if they're returning to their country of origin, there is no issue of integration. There's no issue of membership in Korean society. They're just temporary workers, and so that it's inappropriate to develop multiculturalism policies in relation to foreign workers, or is it? I'm just a bit puzzled, because it sounded like from yesterday's opening statements that the multiculturalism agenda is driven by this 1.5 million people, the majority of whom, I take it, are foreign workers, not foreign brides. So was that just a kind of misleading way for the officials to frame the agenda, that it's really just about foreign brides?
It's a very interesting question, because the number of foreign spouses in Korea is about a little more than 10% of the entire foreign population. But it's like the many individuals and groups were talking about the rights of foreign workers. But when the government decided to pay attention to the issue of multiculturalism, or when they began to start many policies of what they call multicultural policies, it was the the problems of foreign spouses. So I think the question is yes and no, because it started with the foreign brides, and then it began to expand. And I think what was said yesterday was not what reflected sort of a vision or aspiration. So even though it started with the issue of a foreign brides, it will go on and expand. But the problem is that, as you said, the Korean government and many Korean people want foreign workers to stay, not to stay long, but as in many other countries. But I think it's totally impossible, because I think no country actually succeeded in this. They came, and many of them would stay. So I think I didn't say any real proposals in my presentation, but I believe Korea should open their policy. I think the one way that we can actually deal with the human rights abuse in the foreign bride problem is to open door to foreign workers so that they can come as foreign workers and they can find suitable marriage partners. That's okay. Then they have a real choice. But unless we close our door, but it's not actually real closure. You have an official closure, but there are a lot of holes, side doors and back doors, and that's what's happening. Okay. May I ask a quick question? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question to Will. Will, Australia loves Canada because you invented multiculturalism and we perfected it. I am being quite facetious in saying that. But I loved your presentation. It was terrific. My question is, Angela Merkel said multicultural is dead. Clearly it's not. Is the term dead? Is the label dead? Is it time for a new brand? Do we need to the policies seem to be effective, but I know that in our country, the previous government, which was a more conservative government than our current government, the Prime Minister very rarely, if ever, said multiculturalism. He talked about our diversity and used every other language that every other synonym he could find except for multiculturalism. Perhaps it's time that we got with the program and got a new brand. And if Canada can do it, we'll follow.
So I actually, this is a question I've thought about without coming to some conclusion. I do think that in some European countries that the word multiculturalism is poisoned, and to invest a whole lot of time and energy in trying to rehabilitate the word is just a waste of time. And if we can get the policies we're interested in adopted under another label, focus on the policies and don't worry about the terminology. On the other hand, it's worth asking what was the political process by which this word became poisoned? And I think that it's a very disturbing story in many countries. I think essentially the right way to tell that story is that because we live in a human rights era, traditional xenophobia, people who have xenophobic attitudes can't come out directly and say, we don't like blacks, we don't like Muslims. They need to find but so what they say is that we don't like multiculturalism, because that doesn't sound racist in and of itself. So critiques of multiculturalism so one strand, I don't want to generalize, but one strand of the critique of multiculturalism is that it's a politically acceptable way to express xenophobic sentiments, and I think that center-right parties, many center-right parties in Europe, who were worried about losing popular support to far-right anti-immigrant parties, decided that the best way to maintain their support was to adopt that rhetoric against that critique of multiculturalism. And so it's a way of essentially, so that mainstream center-right parties have adopted a discourse that has some of its origins in cloaking xenophobia. And rather than based on any meaningful evaluation of the actual effectiveness of the policies. And so I think there's a more general worry here about the way in which center parties have been complicit in legitimizing a set of discourses and attitudes that has its roots in xenophobia, and that I think we need to fight. So this knee-jerk rejection of multiculturalism, as I say, in some countries it's gone so far that it's not worth the time fighting. But on the other hand, I think that if we too accept that the delegitimization of multiculturalism, we are being complicit in the legitimization of xenophobia, and so so while I don't feel compelled to fight for the word multiculturalism, I do feel compelled to fight many of the critiques of multiculturalism. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, the one of the nice things about being a moderator is that he has the final say, and we are already 3 minutes after 10:30. But so I will ask a question and end this, and have a break, and then we'll start again. So. Professor Kymlicka says that he will not fight for the name of multiculturalism, the concept itself. But I think there's something in the name too, because the problems are, in a sense, inherent. As I said, the word multiculturalism, it does not explicitly say it, but it is an assumption that an individual is a member of a cultural group, distinct cultural group. So I think all the problems happens there because it does not pay much attention to the choice or right of the individual for the culture. You can choose. You may not like your culture, and you can like some other aspects of other cultures, and also the Australian story and Canadian story, these are successes. But I wonder what happened outside, because Australia and Canada has it has a strict migration system. It's a immigration country, but you have control of who to admit. And once inside, then it's okay. You can talk about human rights. But I think those who aspire to come to Canada and Australia, they have human rights too. Well, of course, it's the prerogative of the nation state to decide who to admit. But I think the basic question is about the human rights for mobility. Because under the constitution of most modern countries, we say that you have a right, freedom to move and freedom to reside where you want. But internationally, it is not. So I think the success story is successful because you have admitted only certain kind of people. Well, here, I will stop. This is a privilege of the moderator, and we'll take a 15-minute break and start again. Thank you very much. Okay, shall we start? Yeah, I threw the two questions at the close of the first session. So I'll ask Professor Kymlicka to respond.
So Dr. Han had asked whether it's a kind of fatal flaw of multiculturalism that it operates on the premise that each individual belongs to one and only one cultural group, and that this is, fixed by birth or something, because if that were true, if multiculturalism rested on that assumption, it's obviously empirically unsustainable. We all know that people can belong to many different groups, can learn, can borrow and share from different cultures, that cultural diversity is, as he said, something within each of us and not just a matter of relations between groups. So I agree with him that there's a certain kind of street level way of talking about multiculturalism, a kind of vernacular discussion, a folk discussion of multiculturalism that rests on this picture that each person belongs to one and only one group for their lifetime. I think you can anthropologists and sociologists have done field work which just listens to how people on the street talk about each other. And there is this kind of street-level essentialization of people's membership and identities. So I have two comments. One is that we shouldn't assume that that state policies are based on the same assumptions as street-level discourses. And indeed, they cannot be on this issue, because it's a fundamental human rights principle that the state cannot impose on people an ethnic identity. This is built into the European Convention on Human Rights. It's built into the United Nations, and so people. This is one of our fundamental human rights, is to decide whether or not we want to associate with an ethnic group, and the state has absolutely no legal jurisdiction to impose on people an ethnic identity that they do not freely embrace. Moreover, I would say if you look at the actual substance of multicultural programming, they don't rest on that premise, and that they often support forms of cultural expression that are clearly based on fusion of cultures rather than mono-ethnic identities. So as I say, I don't want to deny that there's a kind of vernacular street-level essentialization in the way people talk about multiculturalism, but I don't think it's a fair criticism of actual public policies. And the other comment I want to make is that it's absolutely a mistake to think that street-level essentialism is the result of having adopted multiculturalism policies. Everything we know from sociology and anthropology is that that's the way people think about each other, whether or not there are multiculturalism policies. So it's not as if that it's only people in Canada that do this, whereas people in France don't. There's no evidence whatsoever that this tendency of humans to put people into boxes and to make stereotypes about what it is to belong to a particular group, that's the consequence of multiculturalism. It clearly predates multiculturalism, and it's found in countries that have rejected multiculturalism.
I agree that these problems are actually older than multiculturalism itself. What I was wondering whether multiculturalism has made the problem more serious or not. But we'll come to that later. And Mr. Pearson, would you respond to my remark that what you think about those who are banging the door of Canada or Australia? Well, once inside, they are treated very fairly, but yes. And after that, we'll take questions.
Migration assumes there are borders, and modern nation states have borders, and Australia has a big border with a big ocean, and so we've had the luxury or the fortune of being able to manage our borders pretty strongly. You look at Europe, where the movement of people is across borders, they manage the movement of people through entitlements and registration cards. In Australia, we have no form of national identity checking. We don't have an Australia card or anything like that. It seems that the management of services is the way that our nations manage their migration. I'm not sure I'm making sense. Whereas in Australia, we do it through visas. And so people come into Australia and their visa determines their entitlement, whether they're a temporary migrant or indeed a citizen. So I think it's our migration program assumes we can manage our border. And then within that, we have a non-discriminatory migration program, and so it is stated your religion, your ethnicity is irrelevant. This year, our migration program will have 210,000 permanent arrivals. This is the gross, if you like, the gross inflow. 130,000 of those people will come on skilled visas. 60,000 of those people will be family visas, family reunion. And 20,000 will be refugee humanitarian intake, so 210,000. In fact, I think there's an extra 4,000 on top of that going into the family stream, a recent government announcement. There is no discrimination as to who is chosen. There will be some selection, however, particularly in the skilled space. In the family space, not so. But in the skilled space, we're looking for people who will find a job in Australia and contribute to the economy. And many people in the temporary program on top of those numbers will, of course, repatriate money, not repatriate, what's the word? Send money home. There's a technical word for sending money home. Remittances, there we go, thank you. So, it does benefit to people to come and work in Australia temporarily, and people do choose after 10 years. Most people, it's over 90% of people after 10 years, will have either chosen to return home, this is out of the temporary program, or will have gone on to become permanent residents. And so it could be argued that the fact that you have to have good English to come in as a skilled migrant or as a temporary migrant, and often trade skills or university education does advantage some over others, but it's on the basis of language, it's on the basis of skill, not on the basis of ethnicity and the fact that somebody might speak 13 other languages at home. And I might just say, in terms of identities, I think basically we have multiple identities. At times, government treat people as though you are sick. Your identity is you're a sick person, and therefore the hospital system will sort you out. You might be a student, and therefore the education system will sort you out. In terms of multicultural policy, it's you as a migrant, I guess, and so policies that come out of the Department of Immigration and Citizenship in Australia. But increasingly for us, it's about special services for those who are most vulnerable, to help them settle, but then making sure that mainstream services are accessible for all.
Thank you. So I will take questions, and the lady, and then I think you are holding your hands. So then the gentleman, and we'll take a three first, and then give chances.
Hello.
Yes. Please identify yourself, and if you can,
from the Philippines,
to whom the question is addressed.
Commission Philippines Overseas. I have two questions, or maybe comments. One question, the first question is, of course, to the professor. I admire your romantic view of marriage, but the reality is, for the Philippines, when the brides are Filipino nationals who are victims of human trafficking, victims of mail order brides, mail order bride schemes, victims of domestic violence, then definitely the state has to intervene. And in the case of the Philippines and Korea, I have to give credit to Korea because this year there was a government-to-government memorandum of agreement signed by the Ministry of Gender and Equality and Family, and the Korean minister and myself, the Commission Philippines Overseas. We had a memorandum of agreement which provides for the protection of women migrants, of marriage migrants, and also the empowerment of marriage migrants of the Philippines. So that's my comment. On my second question is to Will. And it's basically, yes, again, I appreciate your multicultural policy index and the indicators you have used to come up with that index. But I think this is where you see the paradox of the United States, because in terms of the index, they're very low. I mean, consistently 3. And yet, in terms of practice, I think, I don't know whether this is a creation of media, but we get the impression that United States is very friendly to multiculturalism. So is this a question of the difference between public policy and actual practice? And I'm using US as the best example for this paradox. Thank you.
Can you hear? It's on the issue of the relationship between multiculturalism policies and civic integration policies. Can you understand in front? There are two views out here. One, my own yesterday, that there is a substitutive relationship between the two from MC to CI. And now from Warren and Will earlier, we heard an alternative view that civic integration policies are layered on top of persisting multiculturalism policies within a grand design on part of the state. And perhaps, and that's my observation here, which is also self-critical, both of these views are wrong, because they rest on a naive view of politics and the state as a rational, grand designer of a policy. And let me bust this naive view with 3 observations about the nature of public policy making. First, political science know about the reality of path dependence. Keith Bunting, actually, the colleague of Will, wrote an interesting paper on that. If you take path dependence serious, then whenever a policy is created, a vested interest to continue the policy into the future is created as well. So it's very naive to assume there is a kind of change of orientation at the helm at the top of the state, that this will immediately bring everyone on board. So nests and vested industries of multiculturalism within that very complex edifice of a state continue to exist, even if there is a notional change of direction on the top. So that is one factor which messes up the picture of a grand design on part of the state, temporality. But then there's also a functional division within the state. Say, within the German government, there is one agency which since 20 years since it's in existence is kind of a multicultural agency, the Bundesamt für Migration it's called now, the Federal Office of Migration and Refugees, which kind of continues work which previously was under a different label. It was called Ausländerbeauftragte, kind of a mandated office mandated for foreign affairs. If you look at the statements of this sub-agency within the government, it's very multicultural. And it's not necessarily the view of the Federal Ministry of the Interior or of the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not to mention it's not necessarily the view of the Chancellery. So there's a complication of functional divide within government, that the left hand of government doesn't always know what the right hand is doing. And thirdly, the third level of messing up the picture of homogeneity on part of the state is the territorial dimension. There is a federal government, and then there is a municipal government, and there is in federalisms even, I already mentioned federal government, state level or regional or a Länder government. And one knows, for example, that taking the critical case of the Netherlands, which Will took as one exception actually of a state that moved away from multiculturalism, civic integration, it's much more complicated in the Netherlands, because there's an army of young scholars. Dutch always had very talented political scientists who study exactly that process of what is happening with respect to civic integration. At the city level, multiculturalism continues, but not everywhere. Almost every week I get a new paper to review for journals which indeed study the interesting
I'm
case
sorry,
of the
but could
There
you make
is, for
it
example-
shorter? Shorter, yeah. Please. No, go, please end your question. I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, Mr. Kato, yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. My question is Mr. Will, and so my understanding is actually so some of the countries do now go along with the civic integration, but it does not mean the retreat from the multiculturalism. This is my understanding from your presentations. So I'd like to know in 5 years, in 10 years, so how sir, regarding the multiculturalism and civic integration. Now, sir, it does not mean the retreat from the multiculturalism, but I want to know, so in 5 years, in 10 years, what happens? So I'd like to share your prospects. Thank you.
Okay, would you respond?
So on the first question about the U.S., so there's no question that I think that the United States, in terms of the role of diversity in its national identity, that it's just as inclusive as Canada or Australia, and that the United States, like Canada and Australia, doesn't operate with this zero-sum conception of identity. I think that the reason why the U.S. scores modestly on our MCP index is actually related to a difference in the view of the state more generally. And so the United States does not have a tradition of funding civil society organizations in many areas of public policy. So, in Canada, as in many European countries, there are policies that provide state support to environmental organizations, to women's organizations, as well as to minority organizations, and that's part of a belief about the role that most Western countries, I would say, this is oversimplifying, believe that although civil society has a very important role to play, it can only play that role if the state supports civil society. Whereas many Americans believe that state support is not necessary and on the contrary is dangerous because it leads to the co-option of civil society organizations. And so I think so I wasn't surprised that the U.S. scores only modestly on the MCP index. It would have been at odds with other aspects of their political ideology if they got into the business of supporting civil society organizations. Let me just agree completely with Christian's the main thrust of his comment, which is that we shouldn't exaggerate the coherence of state action in fields like this. That there are multiple actors within the state. And we shouldn't assume that all different policies and all different actors are going to somehow we shouldn't assume that they cohere. On the contrary, we know from many other fields of public policy that different actors in the state can actually be operating at cross purposes. That's a familiar observation in political science, and one would expect it in this field as well. But I actually want to make a stronger claim, which is that there's a particular package of multiculturalism policies and enabling civic integration policies that are not just consistent with each other. They actually they mutually support each other. They're mutually supportive, and that enabling civic integration policies help multiculturalism to work. Multiculturalism policies provide a supportive framework for civic integration to work, and I mean that's the positive image I mean, I want to acknowledge again how provisional the empirical evidence is on this, but nonetheless, that's, I don't want to simply dispute the claim that these are logically inconsistent. I want to say, on the contrary, that any sensible approach to multiculturalism will have a dimension of civic integration to it, and that I believe any normatively acceptable approach to civic integration should also include a multicultural dimension. On the projecting into the future, I have no skills at projecting into the future. So, but I would just distinguish what I hope to be some temporary, short-term obstacles from what I take to be more positive long-term trends. So the temporary short-term obstacles is that we live in an era since 9/11 in which immigration and more specifically Muslim immigration has been highly securitized. That people are worried about issues of terrorism and violence, and there's fear at a very existential level around some of these issues. I mean, and the 9/11 bombings, the London bombings, the Madrid bombings, they created an atmosphere in which these issues became highly securitized, and it's almost impossible to have an intelligent, calm, rational discussion under those conditions. I hope, I mean, I just have to hope that that will fade and that we'll go back, we will come to a time when we can have a calm discussion about immigration. And in that longer term frame, when in a moment of calm debate, I think that the vast majority of Western countries, and I believe the same would be true about Korea, we need immigrants. The long-term demographics are, we need immigrants for the labor market, we need immigrants because we're an aging population with low fertility. And so the nativist, the current bout of nativist far-right, close the door, anti-immigrant, anti-multiculturalism is not, in my view, is not sustainable. It doesn't have a sustainable picture for the future. We need to find a way, all of our societies need to find a way of accepting that we're countries of immigration, and that we need a viable model about how immigrants are going to belong to our society. And I think in that long term, I'm actually still quite optimistic about multicultural citizenship.
Okay, Mr. Pearson, you are cute. What your right hand is doing. So, do you represent the right hand or left hand?
I'm a pragmatic soul. Clearly, everything that our government does is not rational. It is not connected up. But I think our approach has been very pragmatic, and I think that's a good thing. There are values that underpin it, and our multicultural policy spells those out. But essentially, work has stuck, and things have fallen away. And we do some things that don't have particularly great outcomes for political reasons on occasion, as is always the case. I guess our focus has been on keeping the eye on the goal. And things have waxed and waned, as you imagine, when multiculturalism was new in the 70s and 80s. Yeah, multiculturalism and multicultural access and equity programs was all the rage, and it was the thing that the Prime Minister of the time really focused on. He had a real social justice concern. Bob Hawke was his name. Along came a new social policy in Australia, a big focus, which was Aboriginal reconciliation, to make sure that we were mindful of the first Australians who had been dispossessed in white settlement. That became a huge focus. And then more recently, under this current ALP government that came in at the end of 2007, a focus on social inclusion. So looking at things like homelessness, intergenerational poverty, intergenerational unemployment. And very recently, multiculturalism has come back and said, hang on, what about us? What about this policy? So things do wax and wane over time. And so, Christian, I think you're absolutely right. It's not perfect. It's certainly not perfect in Australia. It's if only every decision that all governments made were rational, it might be a better world. Or maybe not. Yes.
Okay. We'll take two questions from this side. So, yes, and Professor Yoon, and Okay, one, your first, okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Jacinta Bailey Sobers from Trinidad and Tobago. I want to begin by thanking all the presenters for their very enlightening and informative presentations. Just a few questions. First to Professor Kymlicka and also to Mr. Pearson, yes? Now, Professor, some countries such as my own in Trinidad and Tobago, and we have heard yesterday as we discussed Morocco is similar, have been multicultural over a number of years. Due to historical factors, are there lessons I would ask to learn from such countries which can inform the policies of other countries which are only more recently experiencing multiculturalism? And due to different factors, I would suggest primarily voluntary immigration as opposed to forced migration or slavery or indentureship, as was our experience. Are the implicit or explicit multiculturalism policies of such countries as mine the same or different from the Western societies? Are the objectives of these policies the same? I will say, and is there some usefulness in a comparative analysis? Because I would say that our multiculturalism policies are more focused on the issue of creating a more cohesive society than dealing with migrants, immigrants, I should say. Also, since the focus of this panel is really vision, so multicultural world, I would really like to ask both all the presenters, what will be the elements in your view of your vision for such a world? What are the elements of a vision for a multicultural world? Yes? Mr. Pearson, I would like to ask of you, you spoke about social cohesion measurements. I'm very interested in that, yes? As the Ministry of National Diversity and Social Integration, we also have to put measures in place, being a very new ministry, only 6 months old, to be able to measure social cohesion. And so I was very interested in that particular aspect of your presentation. Does this social cohesion measurements also relate to other local marginalized groups such as persons with disabilities and ex-prisoners and indigenous people, or is it just migrants? I would like to ask. And probably both presenters could tell me, is there a sense of the percentage of GDP which is spent on multiculturalism activities? Because we discussed that in order to really have a multiculturalism policies which are successful, we do need the money. So those are my questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, Professor Yoon. Yeah.
My name is In-Jin Yoon. I'm a sociology professor at Korea University and also one of the organizers of this global seminar. My question goes to Professor Kymlicka. I think your multiculturalism policy index is a very promising research project that enables us to compare the progress and retreatment of a multiculturalism policy in different countries by using objective indicators. So I would like to, participate in this project and to be the Korean partner because, we can expand this kind of research in the Asian context. And at the same time, I think there are some room for further development and elaboration in the multiculturalism policy index, because it is one thing that a country enacted a multiculturalism law and the program, and it is quite another whether it implements, the law in practice. For example, the Korean government adopted the employment permit system in 2004. Certainly the law, improved significantly the conditions of migrant workers. But still, many migrant workers are subject to many forms of violations of their human rights. So we need, indicators, to see whether the multiculturalism policy is in practice. I think the budget can be another indicator to measure the level of multiculturalism policy?
Thank you. And Professor Chung, yeah, and I'll give choices later.
I'm Erin Chung. I teach political science at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. I have a question that either Professor Kymlicka or Mr. Pearson can answer. I noticed in your MCP index that countries like Italy, Austria, and Switzerland scored very low, and Japan and Denmark had scores of 0 in 2010. So I was wondering if you could assess the prospects for this coexistence of multicultural policies and civic integration policies in so-called recent countries of immigration, especially those that have long espoused racial and ethnic homogeneity, and in which citizenship policies are based on descent and nationality is equated with ethno-racial identity, such that naturalizing and becoming a citizen, a Korean citizen or a Japanese citizen is very different. It has very different implications from naturalizing and becoming a Canadian citizen or an Australian citizen.
Okay, so we have 3 questions.
So, the index and my work more generally are based on the experiences of the consolidated Western democracies, and and so I often. Because that's where I live, and that those are the policy debates that I have been invited to participate in. But I definitely don't want to imply at all that the West has some sort of or the rich northern democracies have some sort of monopoly on the virtues of tolerance or coexistence or respect for diversity and pluralism. On the contrary, I would actually argue that that the West probably on the broad historical context has a much worse historical record. So at a time when other societies in South Asia or the Middle East were able to quite successfly have religious coexistence, Europe was engaged in centuries-long religious wars because they were obsessed with the idea of religious homogeneity, and not to mention genocide against indigenous peoples and Nazi genocide and so on. So I actually think that every region of the world has traditions of coexistence and tolerance that are equally as impressive and important as anything that the West has. So I absolutely want to acknowledge that, and there's absolutely no reason to think that the West provides the only models. I absolutely don't want to imply that at all. However, having said that, I do think that as I tried to emphasize, the fact that we're living in a post-war human rights world matters, and that the fundamental challenge today is to how to think about managing diversity in a way that's consistent with these foundational commitments that we have made as an international community to human rights and to the equality of races and peoples. And if we think about it that way, many of the historical traditions of coexistence that other societies have had have limits, just as the Western history has its limits. So, for example, I'm involved at the moment in a project about multiculturalism and minority rights in the Arab world, and the starting point for every discussion on that topic is the rich tradition of religious coexistence in the Ottoman Empire, the millet system in which Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived more or less peacefully for hundreds of years when Europe was killing itself over religious difference. Okay, that's a hugely impressive historical achievement, but the millet system of the Ottoman Empire was a hierarchy. It said that the Muslims were the superior group and they tolerated Christians and Jews. And that model is not consistent with fundamental human rights principles today. And which isn't to say that it can't be adapted in ways that bring it into line. But I just want to, so the West has no monopoly on the models, but I just want to emphasize that the challenge is to think through managing diversity in a human rights framework. And that's partly my answer to the last question about what the relevance of this for countries that have long traditions of ethnic homogeneity and national identities that are premised on homogeneity. I think that is inconsistent with basic human rights. The state does not belong to an ancestral race. The state belongs to all of the people who live in it, or at least all the people who are permanently resident in it. And it's not permissible to have a citizenship policy based on blood. That's just, to my mind, this is not something that should divide multiculturalists from others. This is something that should be rejected by anyone who has any human rights commitments. And so I think that just on human rights grounds, we need to get beyond that idea that you have to have the same blood. You've got to be descended, from several generations of people in order to count as a citizen. We need to get rid of that on simply human rights grounds. I think once that change is made on human rights grounds, we're then going to confront a series of other policy decisions about how to make that citizenship work. And then I think multiculturalism will be maybe a useful tool. On the elaboration of the Multiculturalism Policy Index, I totally agree there's much more work to be done. We need to extend it to other countries. And one challenge when extending it to other countries, this is part of the reason why, part of the reason why we restricted it to the consolidated, wealthy northern democracies, is that if there's a legislative commitment to something, you probably have implementation of it in these countries. There isn't a huge gap between policy commitments and implementation in most of the countries we're looking at. These are countries that have effective rule of law, that they have ways of holding political power accountable. Whereas, so I was also involved in a project thinking about indigenous rights in Latin America, because we have another version of the index for indigenous rights. And in countries like Colombia or Guatemala, you have no idea what the relationship is between a constitutional affirmation of an indigenous right and what's actually happening on the ground. It's just, there are in many cases no connection between what's written on paper and what's happening on the ground. And so, so although we absolutely need to generalize it to more countries, I agree that once we do that, we're going to start facing these really difficult issues about how do we measure implementation, because it wouldn't be enough just to look at what's written on paper.
Jacinta, I might focus on your questions. I have no idea what percentage of our GDP is spent. In some ways, I would say very small. In others, I'd say an extraordinary amount, because 26% of Australians are born overseas and 20% more hadn't one parent. So 40% of the population are benefiting from government programs. And so a lot of money, millions of dollars, I'd be guessing a bit in excess of $100 million a year is spent on very focused settling particularly vulnerable new arrivals, humanitarians, refugees, and in our English programs. But we have a national broadcasting network that's called the Special Broadcasting Service that I think broadcasts language programs in 71 community languages on radio. It has 3 television stations, and so it rolls out into many, many parts of government service provision. In terms of the, these are what I've ducked down to get. This is a recent survey, which is the Scanlon Foundation Mapping Social Cohesion Survey. It's wonderful that a very rich philanthropist in Australia funds this, and the government doesn't, which astounds me, but it is in my briefcase all the time, which is extraordinary. He employs a lot of migrant workers and believes that he should give back to the nation, and does it through this. And the researcher is Professor Andrew Marcus from Monash University in Melbourne. The indexes that he explores are a sense of belonging, social justice and equity, participation, which is political engagement, voluntary work and so on, acceptance or rejection, and a sense of worth. What he finds is that Australia does have high social cohesion, generally speaking, and that has remained stable since 2007 when the research began. And so it has dipped a bit, but it's come back. Recently, in the survey was just released, this year's survey was released just recently, trust is at an all-time low. Trust of government in Australia is diminishing and diminishing fast. And another thing is that spontaneously people are asked what concerns you most. Migration has lifted from third thing that is troubling people most to second. In Australia, we have bipartisan support for multiculturalism, we have bipartisan support for our migration program generally, but the treatment of asylum seekers, irregular maritime arrivals who are arriving by boat out of Southeast Asia and most recently from Sri Lanka, is politically very hot in Australia, and it's played out in the media significantly. And so while underlying their support for migration and multiculturalism, the hot issue at the moment is what we call irregular maritime arrivals and asylum seekers. As well as a national survey, the second book is Neighbourhood Surveys, where he's surveyed 4 local government areas in Sydney and Melbourne, 2 in each, that have very high cultural diversity. And it is a bit disturbing that these areas have much lower levels of social cohesion. So areas where migrants are settling have lower social cohesion outcomes, particularly for everybody. But what he defines as third-generation Australians, which I think is the wrong term, but basically Australian-born and parents were Australian-born. So the long-term residents of these suburbs have very, very low levels of social cohesion, which is a concern because that's, undermining, I guess, or doesn't meet the government's aims of having a cohesive society. And that's where we have to design programs and target our programs to meet not only individuals that have needs, but geographic locations or communities of interest that have needs as well. You can welcome to browse them afterwards, and the URL's in the front if you want to download copies of it.
Thank you. I think time is limited, but I want everybody heard. So please limit to your comments or questions to 1 minute. Okay, I think there are so many hands. Then I think our panelists will do their best to respond. Okay, we'll start from the gentleman over there. So we'll go from right to left. Okay. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Choi. I'm from the United States. This question is directed towards Professor Kymlicka. I greatly enjoyed your presentation and your paper, especially on thinking about multiculturalism from the United States context. But I wonder whether perhaps you may be overlooking the role of underlying economic conditions in the success or the lack thereof of multiculturalism. You talk about a number of different factors, border control, securitization of relations, and also economic contributions. Essentially, you're saying that the more immigrants participate in the labor market, this is seen as a positive factor for multiculturalism. But I would argue that in an economic recession, it's a very different situation. Even if you're not in a recession, but if you're suffering from economic dislocations, particularly on the lower and middle class, its participation of immigrants in the labor market is not going to be seen as positive. In fact, I think native populations, whether it's true or not, are going to see it as a zero-sum game. Jobs that are taken by migrants are jobs that are taken away from native-born folks. And similarly, you talk about the resources that are really invested by the Canadian government in social services and settlement services. In a good economy, these can easily be seen as necessary and valuable, but in a bad economy, I can easily see this as being seen as sucking very special and precious public dollars away from native-born taxpayers. So I don't know what the situation is like in Canada, whether it's been relatively economic stable or not, but I just wonder whether or not the underlying economic conditions and the sorts of drivers of anxiety sort of come into play in a much more greater role than perhaps your paper might indicate.
Thank you. And Dr. Lee, yeah. We are moving from right to left, okay?
Hello, I'm Jun Lee. I work for International Organization for Migration. I have a very quick comment and a quick question to Professor Kymlicka, whose presentation I enjoyed very much. And the presentation reminded me of the fact that in Korea also, the multiculturalism discourse originated from actually civic human rights discourse. I think during the panel discussion, it was mentioned that it is marriage migrants who drive the multicultural sort of policy in Korea. It is true at the government level, but in Korea, it was a labor movement in the 1990s who adopt migrant workers issue in their sort of fight for human rights. And in extension, it included social rights and cultural rights. So it reached the level of discussing multiculturalism, and then the marriage migration issue, and then the government sort of adopted this multicultural discourse. Therefore, it is in Korea also the case that multiculturalism originated from the human rights discourse and movement and action. My quick question is, you said you're not keen on holding on to the term multiculturalism, but you've been quite motivated to fight for the streams of criticism about multiculturalism. My question is, do you have any criticism of multiculturalism that you actually think it quite legitimate, and you privately think it's quite right, perhaps? So that would be my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Please pass the mic to the gentleman in red shirt. Sorry, I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The man in a red shirt is called Bashasha. He's from Uganda. Mr. Moderator, I have two comments. Actually, the first one is related to what the previous speaker has just talked about. Listening to the three of you speak, the question that comes to my mind is, to what extent can the Australian and the Canadian experience really inform the Korean policy-making process, to the extent that the agendas seem to be different to me, and the historical contexts too seem to be different. A little bit, my understanding of the agendas is that it seems to be like the Korean cases come in and get married, but the Australian and Canadian case seems to be come in and settle. So if I can generalize the two extents that way, I don't see how the two seem to be worlds apart. The contextual element is Australia and Canada are historically immigrant countries. In fact, some people say those countries at one point probably belonged to the original people, but those are traditional immigrant countries, whereas Korea is this traditional, Confucian, closed country from the historic perspective. So from that angle, I don't know how much the two experiences can teach the Korean experiences. The second comment is to you, Dr. Han. I'm wondering what kind of homegrown solutions are being formulated to address this bride issue. Can't we pay these Korean women to produce more girls? Or can we pay them to go to marry these men who are in rural areas? Surely the two are not mutually exclusive. As brides coming from out, I think something can also be done inside the country. Thank you.
Is this on? Victoria Greaves from University of Sydney. I have a question for Kyung-Koo, and just to preface that question, I want to refer to Warren's presentation, particularly in which I'm a historian, and I was really appreciative of your kind of short history, if you like, of Australia's policy around immigration. And I got the impression that with Australia, really, there is a feeling that we need to outgrow the White Australia policy, and that is really quite an impetus. So in a way, I think if we're going to consider visions, as a people, wherever we are, we also need to consider our past. If we're considering what we do in the future, we need to think about what has our past been and what can we do to make reparations for those things in our past that have not actually been so conducive to human rights considerations, perhaps, and other things to do with social justice. I'm actually embarking on a new project within Australia to do with the children of American GIs, you know, the idea of war babies. And I've actually asked some questions of my Korean friends since I've been here before this conference about this phenomenon in Korea. And I think that, you know, there's an idea that Korea is not a multicultural nation, but then I'm wondering, well, because I'm concerned about the fate of women and children particularly, I'm wondering, well, what has happened to those children who were born of Japanese, American, and also Australian, I believe, servicemen here in Korea. In fact, you know, due to our wonderful communication systems these days, I got an email this morning from a friend who's working with Ngarrindjeri people in South Australia, and she says, Vicky, my friends here are telling me they have a sister who was born in Korea during the war who's been trying to reunite with them. I mean, there isn't a lot that I can do to help at the moment, but we are, you know, we are going to be working on such a project. So to me, this raises the spectre of, you know, what has happened in Korea with children of mixed race, and how much has this contributed to the idea of Korea being a country that can incorporate others even when they're kin. Thank you.
Thank you. We can finally move to the left. Okay.
Yes, good morning. My name is Noor Al-Malki. I'm from Qatar, and I'm Executive Director of the Doha Institute for Family Studies and Development. My question is directed to Dr. Kymlicka and Mr. Warren. It's about what you think of the effects or impacts of the media and the foreign policy of some countries on the success or failure of their multiculturalism policies. And I would like to elaborate and add to that the issue of anti-Islamic sentiments in some countries. And I have to admit that I can understand the anti-Islamic sentiments post 9/11 in some countries, although I would add that we look at the reasons why this was, and I would add that in my perception, these countries have contributed to what happened, and I would add also that our over-connectedness now through media has made us all very sensitive to what's being happening around the world. I think what happened in 9/11 cannot be sanctioned or condoned, but there are people who see every day pictures, live pictures of countries, their countries or countries that are akin to them, being invaded, being destructed, people are being killed by the masses, and it's on TV. And the reaction is, the only way we'll make these people who propagate these wars against us understand what's happening to us is to bring the war into their backyard. This is not condoned, not sanctioned, but you need to understand it. I think any evaluation of why there is anti-Islamic sentiment should also examine what causes this, what causes the reaction, the anti-West reaction in some Muslim countries. And I would ask why we don't have this in other areas, why this is not directed against Australia, for instance. We don't have Australians coming and bombing Muslim countries. If it were so, maybe this would also happen. It's very important that we examine the foreign politics of some Western states and their contribution to what's going on. Besides, I also added yesterday, As a Muslim woman, as an Arab woman, I accuse the West of fostering fundamentalism. They foster this for their own purpose, and now it backfires on them, it backfires on us as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So everybody has just spoken. Okay. Professor Will?
A lot there to respond to. I can't cover everything. On the first question about whether in times of economic downturn, the fact that immigrants are in the labor market would cease to be seen as a virtue or benefit, but instead be grounds for complaint because they're taking away jobs. I mean, yes, maybe, but as I read the evidence, let me just mention two pieces of evidence that are relevant. One is that studies of resentment towards immigrants, there's a vernacular sense of fair competition. So people don't, the fact that an immigrant succeeds, even if it's seen as zero-sum, I mean, that's to say, even if immigrants succeeds where a native-born person doesn't, that doesn't, according to the surveys and social psychology studies, that does not immediately trigger antagonism, resentment. It's only if it's perceived as that somehow the immigrant had an unfair advantage in getting the job. So people do have, throughout society, they have this sense of what fair competition is. And indeed, one possible risk of multiculturalism is it's seen as providing an unfair benefit that allows immigrants to get a leg up in access to jobs or in access to public housing and so on. And so it would be important to the success of the story that multiculturalism not be seen as creating unfair competition for scarce resources, including jobs. But I don't think that yeah. The other piece of evidence is that if you, again based on surveys, if you ask people what they're afraid of with respect to immigration, it's not primarily economic competition or economic threat. It's cultural threat. And so, so for example, if you ask people in surveys, would you rather have a large number of immigrants who are economically productive, who will contribute to the economy, but who are culturally very, very different from you? Would you rather have economically productive but very culturally different immigrants, or would you rather have immigrants who are exactly like you, but who are not going to be net contributors to the economy? People overwhelmingly choose to have immigrants who provide no economic benefit but no cultural threat. So cultural threat is perceived as more important, is a more important driver of anti-immigrant sentiment than perceptions of economic contribution. So, I mean, obviously both play a role and we shouldn't ignore the economic dimension to it, but I do think that perceptions of cultural threat are really deep, they're really important, and that's part of what multiculturalism should be aiming to address. On the issue of the valid criticisms of multiculturalism, I think there are two this is oversimplifying, but there are two inherent risks. On the one hand, multiculturalism can sometimes be perceived as a policy that's only relevant for the newcomers and doesn't engage the native-born majority at all. And if that's the case, it's doomed to fail. I think the multiculturalism, it's going to be successful, has to be about changing the attitudes and the institutions and practices of the larger society. It's not just a policy that only addresses immigrants. It has to be about the way we do things in everyday life in mainstream society. So one risk is that multiculturalism gets reduced and channeled into a policy that only addresses minorities and doesn't engage the majority. But on the other side, the opposite risk is that the majority takes possession, as it were, of multiculturalism and starts to say that multiculturalism and starts to adopt a very self-congratulatory perception that aren't we great? aren't we great that we adopted this multiculturalism policy? In fact, aren't we superior because we've adopted this multiculturalism policy? There's a strain of this in Canada, I have to acknowledge, these racial ideologies have been discredited, but white Canadians sometimes say, have this idea that we're superior to the other peoples of the world because we've adopted multiculturalism. So multiculturalism, rather than being a critique and remedy for ideologies of racial hierarchy, actually can get wrapped up into these self-congratulatory narratives about how great we are as a people, and so the celebration of multiculturalism in Canada actually becomes quite divorced from any real-world concern for the needs of immigrants or of minorities. It just becomes part of this very self-congratulatory identity. So I can see many examples, not just in Canada, but in other countries as well, where multiculturalism has failed in either of those directions.
Professor, we have to close, so we have lunch break to ask questions. Yeah, so.
1 minute each. What can you learn from, what Korea can learn from Canada and Australia? I don't know, because I don't actually know what Korea's strategic intent is. In Australia, it was populate or perish. We needed people to populate a continent. And so that was we need people, and we need the people who can do that in the most effective manner. In the beginning, people like us who can do it in the most effective manner, and that shifted in the 1970s. So I think the question is, what is the aim? Is the aim to fix the fact that men in rural areas can't find wives? Is it that you need a low-cost workforce? I don't know. So I think there needs to be a very clear nation-building intent, and that needs to be articulated clearly, and I think that's leadership is important with that. And we got a sense of that from the people who opened this conference yesterday. But in the end, the way that is communicated as an opportunity to harness and capture rather than a threat, what do we do with the foreign brides, are two very different things. So how do you turn it and make it a positive opportunity? And that leadership is critically important. I can't touch on foreign policy. I wish I could. I'd solve the world. In terms of media in Australia is both wonderful and dreadful, as it is in most countries. Very recently, a current affairs television program ran a story over a couple of nights called The Great Mall of China, as in a shopping mall, in an area that has a very large Chinese migrant population. The world was coming to an end because all the shops were becoming Chinese. Of course they are, because all the customers were Chinese migrants. And in fact, contributing to the economy. Thank you very much. Our Race Discrimination Commissioner is now visiting that television station. But a positive view is when recently that there were protests around the world around the anti-Islamic film. I can't remember what it was called, but it was wonderful then to see the same television program actually introducing or interviewing sheikhs and leaders in the Islamic community who actually spoke out against the protests in Australia quite reasonably. And it was interesting, we were delighted because many of the people who spoke out and had been given media training as part of a program called the National Action Plan that my department funded some time ago. So we were empowering communities to speak for themselves. They didn't need the government to speak, essentially to give them the skills to participate in life in Australia.
I would like to remind you that Korea was sort of a migration country in the past. As a Confucian country, the king, the government was very happy when foreigners come to settle. It's an evidence that your government is a very good government. And actually many Koreans claimed themselves of Chinese origin. I think more than 2/3 of the last names actually trace their origin to China. So during the Joseon period, Korea had a sort of a migration settlement policy. But it was during this great age of nationalism. Korea was, I think, 2.5. It's not the first wave, it's not the second wave. Perhaps the German nationalism came to Korea through Japan, and because Korea lost independence, Korea had to cling to the idea of culture and ethnicity and blood. But the blood in Korea was important in the family, not as all the Koreans as a single homogeneous blood group. Even if you look at the Tangun, the Korean creation myth, closely, if you look at that, it means that Koreans are diverse, not descendants of Tangun. He was a political founder, not a biological father. So the questions of mixed children, I think it improved because Koreans now hate to talk about this blood. I think it's very backward. So they tend to talk about culture. But again, culture it's just another catchy word for blood. It may be used. So I think it will go better, but not very well. So I think the most important thing about the migration policy is to decide which problems, which questions can be dealt with by policy means. There are problems which cannot be dealt with policy measures. I think you have to admit that. I think that's the first step. But having said this, I have to close this session. I'm very sorry to interrupt you, and I'm very sorry to interrupt some of the people in the audience, but we have to have lunch and we have to have other programs. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much, faculty members. Thank you very much for your active participation.